What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Knowing how to teamfight and understanding what's going on is quite obviously an extremely important part of the game, and by understanding all of the mechanics and things that take place, you can gain a much higher level understanding of the way teamfights work and have a huge leg up in your games. Let's get started. Now when it comes to teamfights, I like to group things that influence the fight into two categories. You have the strategy-oriented mechanics, which you can control through smart decision making and strategical play, and you have the champion-oriented mechanics, which are influenced by, of course, the champions in the game. Overall, there's quite a few mechanics and it can be kind of complex, so let's go over each one and give you a general understanding of all of them. Starting out with the strategy-oriented mechanics. These mechanics influence fights very heavily and are all about how you and your team play out the team fight. The first one being the initiation. Initiations set up positioning for a fight and influence it really heavily. A poor initiation will lead to poor positioning, and it's why a large amount of fights are decided by them. Catching someone out is a great way to set up a fight, and most often if your team initiates a fight, your positioning will be set up quite well. To get an initiation to work, you need to set up the fight and go in on your opponents when their positioning is poor. In addition, a good initiation can often lead to a lot of picks and a one-sided fight. Initiations get countered by disengage, as well as being vulnerable to re-engages depending on how well your attempt was. Re-engages can happen if your initiation failed and caused an extended chase on the opponents who have good positioning, so make sure you initiate in a way that causes your opponents to have poor positioning as a whole, which leads me into my next mechanic, positioning. Decided by the initiation, positioning in a fight is really important since it determines whether or not kiting will be possible. If you have poor positioning, you will fall prey to your opponents and die very quickly, without having an opportunity to kite. The way positioning works is that it's all about having three lines. You have the front line, the mid line, and the back line. The front lines try to create an impassable wall for your opponents, so these people tend to be super tanky and really good at initiating. The mid line is people who have a good mix of damage and tankiness, and are using their damage to help kill tanks or protect the bat line, or potentially dive in with the front line as well. And the back line is of course the super high DPS carries that are extremely squishy but do tons of damage, and thus must stay in the back and be protected by the mid and front lines. The front line tries to zone out or dive in onto opponents, while the mid line tends to have a really dynamic role, and then back lines try to kill whoever is out of position or to kill the enemy front line. Knowing what line your champion fits into and what role you can play in the fights is quite important and should help you position well, since if you know that, positioning becomes quite simple. The back line goes in the back, the mid line goes in the middle, and the front line goes in the front. Set up your positioning with an initiation and you should be good to go. Whereas if you are getting initiated on, your positioning will likely be a mess and you kind of just get countered because it's likely that multiple players on your team will not be in the correct line that they're supposed to be in. After that, we have kiting, and I personally believe that kiting is the strongest mechanic in the entire game, and the reason for that is because it allows you to take absolutely zero damage while outputting full DPS onto a target. Especially in the tank meta, a vast majority of champions get really wrecked by kiting since you can do it properly and avoid damage so effectively. Kiting a team is quite easy to execute. You just need to crowd control the targets diving into your backline, and if your team works together, it's not too hard to pull off, especially since players tend to dive in on backlines a lot harder than they actually should. Run away from your opponent while hitting them and using crowd control, and by moving back into the space that you have, you can make kiting work quite easily. The true counter to kiting now is flanking. Flanking ensures that your opponent will have poor positioning and have no space to kite out, since kiting does require a lot of space to pull off properly, since flanking creates an inescapable collapse onto a target that will just get bursted down really easily. So make sure to ward up the sides and have vision of surrounding areas if you are vulnerable to a flank. And then we have late game scaling and team composition. Both of these influence how you want to play out teamfights, and so you really need to understand what your team composition is doing and how exactly you can win a fight. Perhaps it's diving in on your enemies, or maybe it's bursting down a target, or maybe it's just protecting your carries. Look at where your team is strong in and what your composition is good at doing. In addition, for late game scaling, you have to understand that when the game hits kind of the late game, it changes quite a bit. The fights become not so much about bursting and diving in, but rather kiting and protecting your carries once it hits the late game. The fight dynamic changes a lot since carries become way more powerful, and so it's important to consider the state of the game when going in for fights, as if you have reached the late game where the carries are strong, playing around them becomes extremely important. Next up, we have the champion-based mechanics, which are influenced by what your champions can do and often play a huge role in the strategy-oriented mechanics. First off, we have burst damage. This ties in with initiations and flanks quite a lot since burst damage can lead to a lot of picks and is really good at just one-shotting targets. It gets countered by utility items such as a Banshee's Veil and Zhonya's, as well as standard defensive items to at least some extent. When you're playing with or against burst damage champions, it's important to understand the potential that those champions have to really dictate a fight by one-shotting someone. Be very wary of the power that they can create, as they will look for quite a bit of plays and can really punish poor positioning quickly and effectively. If you can outplay the burst defensively somehow, or can deny opportunities for burst onto a squishy target from your opponents, those champions become a lot weaker and won't have as big of an impact, since they won't be able to get their burst damage off. Next, we have sustained damage, which gets countered generally by raw tank items. Sustained damage is really powerful when you can back it up with kiting, since effective kiting will let a sustained damage champion get off an extremely large amount of damage as the fight goes on. However, targets that deal sustained DPS can potentially be vulnerable to burst damage if they are squishy, so when you're playing with sustained damage champions, it's important to position well and play a kite-oriented teamfight to protect them to extend the duration of the fight so that they can get off as much damage as possible. Sustained damage relies on having good positioning quite a lot, so it's important to set that up when playing with sustained damage champions. And then after that, we have crowd control, which really affects kiting. There's two types of crowd control: hard CC, which completely disables a champion like stuns, knockups, taunts, etc., and soft crowd control, which only really hinders a champion, which is mainly just slows. Both are really great for kiting, and if your team lacks crowd control, kiting will be quite difficult and you will need to find other options for your team to take in teamfights. Crowd control really is a very powerful mechanic since kiting in itself is so powerful. Having lots of crowd control is quite obviously really good, and it's a great way to play around in fights. It can get countered by cleanse mechanics like Quicksilver Sash and Mikhail's Crucible, so watch out for those to be sure that you aren't really getting outplayed by them. Overall, you want to make sure that you make the most of your champion-oriented mechanics that you have available to you to set up your strategy-oriented mechanics for a great team fight. Plan out and set up the fight, and don't force fights too hard or you might mess up a lot of strategy mechanics. You need to be calculated, get some vision, and plan things out. Have a good understanding of the mechanics, and you can use those to influence how you play things out quite effectively as a whole, since they influence each other quite a bit. Use the mechanics to their fullest potential with the understanding of what your team composition is good at, and you should be able to set up some really good team fights. Anyway, if this video was helpful, definitely make sure to hit that like button so I know. My name is Jeremy, and that's it for my video on mastering teamfighting. Hey guys, it's me, Jeremy. Thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, definitely make sure to hit that like button so I can tell, and if you're interested, definitely check me out on all the socials, of which you can see over there. And if you really enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe for some more awesome content in the future, as well as you can check out some of my other videos up here and over there. Anyways, that's going to be it. Thank you so much for watching, and of course, I'll see you guys next time.